can win the Super Bowl. You had plenty of AFC teams in there. Who is the biggest challenger to the Chiefs?
I mean, if we're talking about the league in general, I mean, I think it's the Detroit Lions. I think this team is through and through one of the most complete units in the NFL. They're excellent up front, and their upgrades that they made to the defensive line, I think this might be one of the best front sevens in the NFL, period. The one thing that they have to figure out is the secondary, which is not a good question mark to have coming into the season. But the way that they've approached it in training camp, where every position is up for competition, they have a lot of talented young guys in there, and they've sort of reworked their defensive philosophy in the offseason. I think this team is very tough. They're very good. And, they've made the necessary improvements to put themselves in a position where they're an absolute Super Bowl contender. I have them as a Super Bowl favorite.
So where are you separating then Lions v Niners in the NFC? Sounds like you have the Lions ahead of them.
I do, and I mean, I think part of it is obviously it's hard. It's hard to come back from a Super Bowl loss. I mean, statistically, it's just difficult to see teams doing that. And San Francisco, what they've done, I think, is smart this offseason, but you're seeing them sort of enter that. Let's slow the pace down a little bit. We know we're going to have to pay Brock Purdy. At some point, one of these two wide receivers is going to leave. Like, this has definitely been a readjustment offseason. And let's see if we can get hot with a few of these flyer free agents that we've signed. I don't think it's a bad strategy, but that combined with the fact that every team has been building their roster to try and stop that offense because it's now run by, I think, 60% of the NFL, it works to your disadvantage. And at some point, you're going to face one or two seasons where, just like the Patriots did, you're going to have to rework what you do really well in order to make it back to the game.
One more NFC team that I want to touch on with you, who you did have in your 12 teams who could win the Super Bowl, is the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I agree that they can win the Super Bowl. I think I'm a little bit more down on them than most people because of how they finished the year last year. Do you have an explanation for why they went 1-6 down the stretch after beating Buffalo and how they looked the last, 35-40% of the season?
I think these things happen generally, but they happen especially when you have inexperience at the coordinator positions, right? And so you had two non-play calling guys taking a big spotlight for the first time. The way that Shane Steichen ran that offense was a lot different than the way that Jalen Hurts ran that offense last year. And then you try to make a last minute change. You try to shoehorn Matt Patricia into a position where he wasn't comfortable calling that defense. It wasn't necessarily what he wanted or what he liked. And so you have all these complications. You start to lose faith quickly from a veteran team. And I think it's smart to bolster this offseason a guy like Vic Fangio, where he comes in and assuages a lot of that concern because he has that caliber. He's the guy that invented the defense that almost every team in the NFL is running. He knows how to tweak it and to maximize it. And he helped that team down the road during their Super Bowl season as a consultant. So I think you're bringing good vibes back into the building, and you showed the team that you're willing to upgrade this offseason. You spent some money, and we can argue whether it's smart money or not, but adding players like Saquon Barkley, that helps a locker room and that helps sort of snuff out some of the bad feelings that were taking place towards the end of the season.
Connor Orr, great job as always generating NFL conversation in July. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Danny.
That's Connor Orr from Sports Illustrated. And on the herd, I'm Danny Parkins. We got Rick Bucher coming up in a little bit. Ashley Brewer is in with the news. NFL conversation, though, it's never out of season. It's never out of style. And our next guest, senior NFL writer for Sports Illustrated, Connor Orr, he does an amazing job of giving us things to talk about in football in the offseason. And for that, I always appreciate him and say thank you, especially because he's willing to come on the show and let me tell him why he's wrong, which takes a very good sport. So, Connor, I appreciate it. Your column is 12 teams that can win the Super Bowl. And I frankly reject the premise that there are only 12 teams in July that can do it. We can get into that. But then in the lead of your column, you say, normally I do 13, and I had to stretch to get to 12. Why do you think the league is so top heavy this year?
I think just in general, right? I think we've got a few teams with a few really good owners who have either stumbled into generational quarterbacks or have kind of figured out the formula where you can steadily supply your team with quality personnel that both the GM and the coach can agree on and coach, right? And so I think that you have a couple of these franchises that can do things well pretty consistently. And then you have a bunch of these other franchises who are either, not spending money, they're not adequately pairing their coaches or GMs, or just in general sort of existing in that orbit of mediocrity that we see a lot of the league exist in.
All right, so Dallas. I don't like their offseason. I don't think anybody does. But they've won 12 games 3 years in a row. They're co-favorites, basically, according to the numbers, in the NFC East. They can't win the Super Bowl, a team that's won 36 regular season games in the last 3 years?
I don't like Dallas for a couple of reasons. Again, I don't like their offseason, like you mentioned, and I really don't like the idea of basically placing the entire organization on a 1 year contract. You're not supporting anybody. And I think the more that I deal with players, the more that I deal with coaches, one of those key ingredients to success is feeling supported, feeling valued. Teams that tend to pay players earlier than they should tend to do better. Teams that reward their players. Right now, all of your tentpole generational talented players have no contractual security. Your head coach has no security. Most of your staff are on 1 year contracts. I just don't think that's a way to run an organization. And then to not support them at all in free agency. Now, sure, could everything bounce the right way and that pressure ends up generating some good? Possibly, but rarely have I seen it work that way, where you're basically getting a negative feedback loop from ownership, and then you're saying, "Yeah, that's a way to get out there and make me want to win."
Side note, I've said I'm not a believer. Like, I believe that the Cowboys will pay Dak Prescott. It makes no sense. There would be no precedent for a team saying 30-year-old quarterback, healthy in his prime, who we developed coming off of his best year ever, MVP runner-up. We're cool losing him for nothing, and we're going to make him prove it. Like, I don't believe it. It's never happened before. Are you buying it that Dallas maybe doesn't want Dak Prescott beyond this year?
I think that they're gonna make him earn it, or they're gonna make him wait, kind of like they did with the initial contract. I mean, I remember going down there and reporting that for Sports Illustrated the first time that he signed the deal, and how far off they were initially, and how they wanted him for a little bit longer, and how Dak wanted to come up sooner. But the reality of this is, I mean, some of the agents that I've spoken to recently, if Dak Prescott hits the open market, I mean, he's potentially a $60 million a year player for a desperate team that needs a 1 or 2 year fix. And Dallas knows that. And I think Dak Prescott knows that. So I think that's probably what is creating the logjam at this point. Like, if they didn't want to pay him earlier and they're going to make him wait, now Dak sees the other end of the tunnel here, which is a complete resetting of the quarterback market.
So back to your list, 12 teams that you think can win the Super Bowl, and you said you had to stretch to get to 12. So what teams barely made the cut?
The Texans, and I wrote this in the column too. Like, I think that they may not win the division, but I think that their ceiling is higher than the Colts, if that makes sense, right? I mean, we look at how great, quote unquote, the Texan season was last year, but they had an easier schedule and they only scored, I think the Colts scored 20 more points on offense than the Texans did last year. And so you can look at their season as, okay, it's the start of this great ascent. And that's what ignited all these behaviors like signing Stephon Diggs and being aggressive in free agency. Or you can look at it as, okay, they're kind of microwaving this a little bit. And it'll all depend on how CJ Stroud handles a bigger load. They're going to have to evolve this offense a lot beyond what they had last year. And teams are going to treat them more seriously. They're going to have a harder schedule. Things get more difficult.
So you and I have talked NFL for a long time. You know that I will also look to the odds makers here. And through NFL history, there are some teams that are out of nowhere Super Bowl winners. They are more the exception than the rule, right? I could give you the 99 Rams who were 150 to 1. They found, a Hall of Fame quarterback who was bagging groceries. So that's an extreme outlier. But 01 Patriots, they were 60 to 1. 17 Eagles, they were 60 to 1. The first Montana Super Bowl champion was a preseason 50 to 1 team. And so if I extend the odds out that way or look to commonalities there, it's out of nowhere quarterback, right? That really elevates a team. Brady, Carson Wentz, Nick Foles, Joe Montana, in the Rams case, Kurt Warner, out of nowhere quarterback who's great, which brings me to my Chicago Bears. There's no way that if Caleb Williams has a CJ Stroud, Justin Herbert-esque rookie season, that the Bears could win the Super Bowl?
Why not? Right? I mean,
Well, you didn't have him
and
in
I
your
think
12.
well, I'll say this. I mean, so much more would have to go right in order for that to work than I think some of the other teams on this list. But here's the one thing that I'll mention is like, when Carson Wentz had those couple runs in Philly, what they were doing was they were drawing from an offense that in college that he ran that defenses at the NFL level were not